Yes, Ms. Richards.
So I'm going to turn now to ask the group some questions about the concepts of consent and informed consent. I'm going to start with some basics. Is this right? And these questions will almost entirely be in relation to adults with capacity. An adult with capacity should not be subject to medical intervention unless they've given a valid and informed consent. That's a basic and fundamental principle of clinical practice.
You're all nodding.
Yes.
But the reason I say that is that nods don't go down in the transcript, I have found.
Yes, we agree with that general statement.
Yes, that's very fine. Yeah.
And your report explains that the philosophical basis for that, for informed consent, is patient autonomy. If it's not too circular a question, and this is a question I've been asked again by call participants to ask, is it possible to say what the philosophical basis is for respect for patient autonomy?
Yes. I think it goes back to this idea that if you are dealing in any area of life that is important to or matters to people, then you are required to have permissions or rights or maybe obligations come into the picture as well. If you do something that intervenes to affect what the person might have otherwise done, is choosing to do at present, or hopes to do in the future. So if we respect people's autonomy, we have to understand that in dealing with them in any way, in a professional capacity, or even as a friend or a relative, we want to take on board this idea that the things that we do that have an impact on them and the way that they can live their lives are things that we ought to think about, to some extent negotiate, and in certain circumstances, particularly in professional circumstances, but also in our personal relationships, might want explicit consent to proceed any action.
Just to add, sorry, go ahead, Julian.
So philosophically, the concept of autonomy dates back to the ancient Greeks, and it comes from the Greek word autos nomos, which means self-governing or self-determination. And it's the fundamental concept of Western liberal societies that each of us has our own life, that we should be free to fashion and shape as we see fit, whether we become a builder or a dancer or a doctor. We should be able to determine the fate of our own life. And in that sense, our life is the fundamental unit for us. And so derivative from autonomy are concepts like privacy and confidentiality, which is the right to control information about yourself. And within that is the more formal concept of informed consent, that if something is done to us or that affects our life, we should agree to it. And that's why informed consent is important, because each of us should be free to live our lives according to our own values and choices. That's why lockdown is such a fundamental issue, because in that sense, people no longer have freedom and autonomy. So it's, and this is not just a Western liberal idea for everyone. They have goals, wishes, plans for their own life and how they want it to go. So it's a fundamentally important concept in ethics.
Professor Cave.
Yes, just to add to that, our protection of autonomy over the years has changed, and the sorts of autonomy that we've valued has changed too. So right back to the 13th century, there are legal cases that protect bodily autonomy. So they protect patients' right to say yes or no to the treatment. And then more recently, the focus has changed to protect individual autonomy, which reflects the person's values and preferences when they're making their decision. But also, not only is it recognised that people have this right to make a decision for themselves, but the concept of relational autonomy recognises that very often people make these decisions as part of a group, as part of relationships. So shared decision making may be taking a decision with the doctor through dialogue as to what might be the best course of events, or it could be relational in relation to family members, for example, that decision might be made.
So is this right, that the aspect of autonomy... sorry, Dr. Kazarian.
Adding to Emma's point, I think that there is an important point to make about consent and informed consent, because I think consent has always been an important part of medical practice, in the sense that doctors would have to get the consent of the patient in order to perform an operation or another procedure. But the fact that consent now has to be informed means that the patient, in order to make an autonomous decision about their own body and their own life, has to be properly informed about what is going to happen to them in terms of the medical procedure, the treatment that will be administered. So over the years, this has evolved, and consent has always been important, but now information is also very central to medical decision making.
That's an important point, and information has always been important to a degree, because you could never give authority for something to go ahead without having a basic idea as to what is proposed. But that element has become increasingly important as time has gone on, and perhaps we'll explore that later.
Yes.
I won't go into lots of detail now.
And was this right? The aspect then of autonomy to which informed consent is most directly linked is the right to self-determination, picking up on Professor Sabalewski's answers earlier.
Yes, but I think it's also worth considering that the other side of having autonomy is having a certain degree of responsibility, and a good consent process, which involves the information provision that Mel is demanding, is something that engages you with a process that you then may feel more connected to and take some responsibility for in a way that you wouldn't if you had simply been told that something was going to happen or discovered belatedly that something had happened.
And you say in your report, the doctrine of informed consent also promotes patient dignity, partnership and trust. And I wondered if I could invite one of you to perhaps expand upon that idea.
Well, dignity is one of those concepts that is rarely specifically defined, and it's often used. And in my view, dignity is determined by autonomy. It's your view of what your dignity is. And so dying with dignity is dying how you want to die. My mother died a couple of years ago, a very painful and unpleasant death that I think wasn't dignified, even though she was receiving palliative care, because that's not what she would have wanted. So in that sense, I think in order to cash out what dignity means, you have to know what the person's values and how they want to be treated. For some people, dignity involves independence. For some people, it involves having family around them. For some people, it involves dying peacefully. So it's determined by the person's own values and idea of their life. So I think dignity is a concept which is, again, derivative from autonomy, in my view. Other people will differ.
I agree, but I also think there is a sense in which you can undermine or ignore somebody's dignity, and by engaging with them in the sort of meaningful relationship that is required if you are going to properly obtain consent to a serious intervention, is a way of very visibly respecting their dignity and hopefully upholding their dignity, because at the end of the process they will feel that they haven't simply been bounced along or ignored, but they have become part of a process that has, for example, given them an opportunity to give a clear account of their best interest, which is based on their values and the things that give their life dignity.
To pick up a little bit on the other two values that you mentioned, so in relation to trust, this is about trusting the profession and trusting individual clinicians to respect that individual's autonomy and dignity, and to protect and to respect their best interests, to do what is right for their best interests. And partnership is about, in part, not being abandoned, so not simply being given information and told to go and make the decision, but having somebody there who is able to engage in a dialogue with the patient so that they can be supported in making that decision on the basis of the relevant information.
I think I would just add that trust is somebody else knowing what you want. So it's understanding your values, and that's why trust is related so much to autonomy. I just wanted to say something about information at this point, because information is so fundamental to autonomy. You can't be autonomous without actually knowing what the choices are that you have, what they're going to be like, insofar as you can know what they're going to be like. So not being informed fundamentally undermines your autonomy, because you're denied the opportunity of real choice that is, as attracts the world. So information is absolute. Sharing information and providing information is absolutely a prerequisite for autonomy.
And I think the way we've answered this question also demonstrates that we think that information is intrinsic to consent. The provision of adequate information is intrinsic. It's somehow redundant in a way, ethically, to talk about informed consent, because without information, as Julian says, you are not doing the important moral work that you set consent up to do, which is to respect the autonomy of individuals.
And I agree absolutely that autonomy is fundamental to giving consent, to giving informed consent. But it is clear that for a number of reasons that hasn't been recognised as fully as it should, either in the law or in professional guidance. I mean, when you're ready, we can go through that in more detail, but I don't want to give you that detail if you're not ready for it.
Yes, then we'll come to the professional guidance fairly shortly. I think we won't be doing a detailed exploration of the case law, not least because you've referred to it very helpfully in your report. Just before we come on to that in a little more detail, you also say in your report that there are three elements, or not necessarily exclusively, but three elements of consent. Agency, by which you mean capacity, and I don't think I need to ask you any more about that. Autonomy, which we've just been discussing, and then liberty, which you describe as the absence of coercion. And you go on in your report to talk about, when considering the issue of coercion, it's important to remember one can effectively coerce someone without intending to do so, particularly if one holds a position of power and operates within a context where the other person is disempowered by their circumstance or role. So, but power imbalance there. Could you assist us a little more on this issue of absence of coercion and power imbalance?
Yes. I think when we hear the word coercion, we become very defensive and we bristle slightly, because one thinks of it as a very overt action and one that might even involve physical restraint or something that really places an obstacle or barrier in the way of someone doing what they want. But as we suggested, you can sometimes find yourself operating within institutions that make you feel vulnerable, or whose mores you don't quite understand, or whose language is opaque to you. All of these things can have an effect on you that means that the decisions that you come to may not be as voluntary as we would want them to be. And as time has gone on, sociologists, anthropologists, organisational psychologists, all sorts of experts have helped us understand more and more about how power dynamics work. And the health service is not immune to the operation of power dynamics. And even before you enter the hospital setting, you may have been disempowered by your place in society. We know that social and economic health inequalities translate all too easily into health inequalities. So there are all sorts of ways in which we have to be mindful of the fact that whilst a doctor or any other healthcare professional might make assumptions about the basis upon which they're discussing a complex matter with a patient, what they really need to find out is the extent to which they need to clarify, make explicit, enable understanding, relax somebody into an environment they are finding very stressful or difficult. And without that, we would worry not that anybody had the intention of making someone do something they didn't want to do, but that someone hadn't been mindful of the extent to which we can feel subsequently that we were coerced by our environment and the situation we find ourselves in.
I think it's worth defining the concept of coercion. So the paradigm example of coercion is that someone stops you at the ATM and says your money or your life. So what happens in coercion is your options are restricted, so that the option that you either most want or which is best for you is no longer available to you. So freedom or liberty is having more options. Autonomy is choosing the option that you value. So when a structure or a person or institution limits your options so that the one which is best for you or that you would autonomously want is not available, that's effectively coercion. So when the BMA refuses to support euthanasia, that's coercive because it removes the option of euthanasia to people who would want that. They might not choose it autonomously, but not having that option is a restriction of liberty and is in effect coercive.
It's important to make a distinction between coercion and the support that might be required to a greater or lesser degree depending on the patient in order to help them make a decision. Some patients might even say to a healthcare professional, what would you do in this situation? And were that healthcare professional then to tell them that's not necessarily coercion, that's not taking options away, that's giving support and guidance to make a decision.
So if I may, what happens when knowledge is paraded, which the individual doesn't have, but the knowledge necessarily is, let us say, is confidently given, but may not necessarily be right? The individual doesn't know what other knowledge there may be out there, and indeed it may be expressed in long words which he may not have familiarity with, particularly since medicine, like any other profession, may have its own jargon. To what extent is he able to have the autonomy to choose a choice which he would prefer to have when he doesn't know he's got it?
He doesn't. So that is effectively coercive. So not communicating what the real nature of the options are insofar as you know them in a way that the patient can make a meaningful choice is another way of disempowering and failing to respect the patient's autonomy. Another example is if you fail to obtain information that is available that would be relevant to the patient, you can also be guilty of that failure if it was relatively easily available and relatively costlessly available. And that also undermines the patient's autonomy, even if you don't have the information, but you could have got it. It's important to give people a fair go and to enable them to make choices that are available, in a way that they can understand.
It links back to our previous discussion of trust, because when you go to any expert, I think you trust that they will to some level be better informed than you, although of course an expert patient is a very well informed individual and that should never be forgotten. But you trust that there is something more perhaps that they can give you. And if someone hasn't kept up to date or doesn't realise the importance of certain scientific or medical information, and that is clearly something that we would expect of them. The GMC makes very explicit now the responsibility to keep up to date, as they put it. Then we would feel that there was also a failure of trust, and that on reflection, the doctor or any other healthcare professional might not have been as worthy of being considered trustworthy as we assumed.
Can I give you an example from when I did practice medicine, which I think illustrates the importance of this? Imagine a patient's going to have an operation on their chest to remove a tumour, and one of the big risks is lung collapse, pneumonia, intensive care, death. And the most effective form of analgesia is what's called a thoracic epidural, which is placing a small tube around the spinal cord and injection of local anaesthetic. And that maximally reduces the chance of pneumonia. But it has a 1 in 10,000 chance of causing damage to the spinal cord and paraplegia. So what typically happened is doctors would come in and say, we're going to do an operation. It's very important you don't get pneumonia. We'll put a small tube around your spinal cord, and there's a small chance of damage to your spinal cord, but this is the best form of analgesia. They didn't say that there's an alternative, a narcotic infusion with something like pethidine or morphine and vigorous physiotherapy, because it wasn't as effective at reducing the pneumonia, but it has no chance of spinal cord damage. Now, which of those two options people will choose if they understand the nature of them will differ. Some people will want to have a maximum chance of living. Some people will want to avoid paraplegia. And unless you know what those options are, you can't be autonomous. Just saying you can accept or reject the operation with the thoracic epidural is not genuinely respecting somebody's autonomy. So you have to provide the options and meaningful information in order for the person to be fully autonomous. And of course, some people will choose options that may involve certain greater risks, but that's their entitlement as an adult human being that has their own life.
Julian referred to the importance of giving meaningful information. That doesn't mean all information. This isn't a duty incumbent on healthcare professionals to give over every bit of expertise that they have, because in most cases, that would make it harder rather than easier for a patient to make a decision. So it's about being selective and selecting not just on the basis of the particular illness or problem, but on the basis of that patient and what that patient needs to know in order to make a decision.
Adding to everything that's been said, and I agree with everything that's been said, I think there is the importance of giving the patient information in order for them to make autonomous choices about their particular condition. But another important thing is to make patients aware that actually they are entitled to have information, and they are entitled to different rights, such as having a second opinion, for instance, if they disagree with the doctor or they want to have more information and they want to have more options, and the different avenues they may have if something goes wrong. So this is something that was a bit put aside in the past, but I think now there is an effort to communicate this type of things with patients, the fact that they are entitled to be informed, and to a certain degree. And of course, what Emma said is the fact that we don't have to give all the information, but we have to give the information that is relevant to the patient and that is important to the patient. And so patient communities, people in general, need to be aware of that fact.
Is another aspect of this process a requirement, subject of course to emergency considerations, to give the patient sufficient time and to make the patient aware that they have the opportunity to ask questions or seek further information?
Yes, I think that becomes an increasingly important consideration, given the complexity of what is being proposed, either as the best option or a choice between options. And of course, time is an amazingly valuable resource in this regard. So if one were, for example, heading towards complex cardiac surgery, there may be the opportunity for several discussions, but also there will be the opportunity to provide written information, as long as that is accessible and available in a language that the person can understand. Increasingly, one can turn to charitable organisations to get very clear, patient-focused information. And in a sense, there's a sort of alliance around this idea of informing people. And that's easiest to do when something is planned, where we have time, and where various actors are taking part in that particular illness or disease. Where it's much more difficult is if something's unexpected and things have to be dealt with very quickly. And therefore, we do have to make a distinction between emergency situations and those where we have the luxury of time.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, so if the goal is to respect autonomy, the goal is for the person to understand the options available to them, their risks and benefits to them, and to make a decision on the basis of their own values. That's the goal. How you get there doesn't matter. Sometimes it might require many different exchanges of information. Sometimes it will require a wide range of people to be involved. Sometimes it will require written information, a video, use of the internet. But the goal is what matters. And we need to do what is necessary to achieve that goal. So the GMC I saw in their latest guides are lots of very helpful information. But what really matters is the person understands their options and makes their own choice about them. That's what we have to achieve. Sorry, Emma.
No, not at all. To follow on that point, actually, the GMC also recognises that time is a pressure which healthcare professionals are constantly under. The Patterson review, for example, a recent review into the actions of breast surgeon Ian Patterson, who performed procedures without consent at times, one of their recommendations is that we make sure that there is time between being given information and giving consent for complex operations. So even now, even today, we haven't got this quite right. It's a very complex balance because there is so little time in order to run through these processes.
I want to ask you to look at some of the earlier guidance from the 1950s onwards. There's 3 or 4 pieces of guidance. They're fairly short for the most part, and I think with one exception, you've referred to them in your report. And I just want to, in part, place them into the public domain so that others can see them, but ask you for any comments you have on them, and in particular, ask you the extent to which the values that you've been discussing emerge from the particular piece of guidance or not. Shimik, the first is MOJU 601_013. Do you need the reference again? Okay. Sorry, we're having just a problem with screen sharing. So we need this document only briefly to give us a date and a purpose. So we can see it's a letter authored by the Medical Defence Union, 17th of April, 1953. It's in the context of whether consent is required for the performance of operations or anesthesia for those who are inmates of young offender institutions. But if we could just go to the second page. And we look at that first paragraph, we can see it says here, I'm closing herewith for your perusal and retention a document on the giving of consent, which I hope you will find interesting and useful. And it was addressed to the Prison Commission. Now that's just so that we can date and see what the document was. Shomik, can we then go, please, to the document that's referred to in the letter, MOJU 601_014, please? So if we zoom in on the top half of the page, please, Shomik, we can see it's a medical defence union document entitled Consent for Examination and Treatment. And it says this: it's not sufficiently widely known by practitioners that in law consent must be given by a patient before an examination can be conducted or treatment administered. And it goes on to talk about how fortunately doctors are not often challenged. If we go on to the general considerations, strictly speaking, it is illegal for any practitioner to do anything to any patient without consent. And then there's a discussion of legal routes and the possibility that the doctor may have committed assault or been guilty of trespass to the person. And then if we could please go in under the significance of consent. Consent means that the individual patient concerned, either by himself or with or through another, has indicated by implication or specifically, preferably in writing, that he's willing to submit himself for examination and for treatment. And then it goes on to talk about the benefit of written consent. And then the bottom of the page, under the heading, the request for consent. To obtain consent, it is necessary for the practitioner to explain carefully to the patient in non-technical language the need, if we go over the page, please, and we zoom in on the top two paragraphs, for an examination to arrive at a diagnosis or decide on the line of treatment. The character and the likely results of the treatment should be outlined to the patient in such terms that he can appreciate fully what is proposed and what may ensue. A practitioner aware of the uncertainties of treatment should avoid sweeping promises and should not minimise the risks that may be inherent in the procedure he proposes. If the patient is one with whom it would be undesirable for psychological or other reasons to discuss these matters, a different procedure may justifiably be adopted. I'll come later to the therapeutic privilege, as I think that would have been referred to then. And then the next paragraph, the consent thus obtained must be genuine consent, not merely an apathetic acquiescence, but a real expressed willingness by the patient to undergo the treatment after he has had its nature, its risks, and its objective clearly explained. Now, I wonder, perhaps starting with Professor Cave, whether I can invite you to say if you have any particular comments on that document, as I say, dating from 1953 and containing at least the kernels of a discussion of informed consent.
Yes, certainly. So you pulled out 4 particular issues. The first one was reference to the fact that many people didn't quite understand what was required, or many doctors didn't quite understand what was required in that situation. And I think that's probably quite true. There are a number of reasons for that, and we've talked about some of them already. One of them flowed from the fact that the NHS was very new. And there was a lot of feeling of gratitude and trust when the NHS was first formed, such that it was felt that a degree of paternalism that we perhaps wouldn't accept today was acceptable at that particular time. Secondly, as we've referred to but won't go into in any detail, the law of negligence at that particular point in time didn't overtly require that risks were explained in a way that the patient could understand, but rather the focus was on what a reasonable doctor would tell patients in a given situation. So that was much more generalised. And also, we've already talked about the focus and guidance at the time being on etiquette rather than ethics. So there wasn't as much explicit reference to the factors that are pointed out in this NDU guidance. Of course, this is from the Medical Defence Union. This is guidance about how not to be sued, rather than ethical guidance. The next thing that you talked about was that consent should generally be explicit, and that certainly complies with what we've said so far. That simply to imply it, although that is possible in some situations, I've no doubt you'll go on to that in short time, but generally speaking, the more explicit the consent, the less likelihood there is for misunderstanding. And then you also talked about information being given about the character of the operation, and that conforms in part to what we'd require now in relation to informed consent. So it's giving information about what to expect. what the risks might be, perhaps to some extent, but doesn't set out to the degree that we do today. That should be driven by dialogue and by an understanding of the values and needs of the patient. So it doesn't go nearly as far as would go today in making sure that it's value specific, and that when we're giving patients information, that's on the basis of what that particular patient and what reasonable patients might expect and need. And then finally, you talked about genuine consent, and I think that reflects the discussions we've had so far about voluntariness and the importance of that.
Thank you. But before we look at the next piece of guidance chronologically that I wanted to ask you about, are there any other observations on this particular document?
I thought it was pretty good, to be honest with you, from 1953. It was pretty impressive. I mean, basically, and this is just to say one thing that maybe was implicit in that document, but I think was there, is that, informed consent requires outlining all the options available to the patient, including doing nothing, and their risks and benefits according to what matters and also what matters to the patient. And that's essentially what that document said. It didn't discuss in great detail the risks and benefits of doing nothing, but it did describe quite well the requirement to describe the sort of risks and purpose, as it put it, of the procedure. So the person really wants to undertake it. And that's the essence of making an autonomous decision. So I think you can see there respect for autonomy back in 1953.
I think it's also rather poignant that the covering letter shows us that this is going to be applied to young people whose freedom has been restricted and who might not have a great deal of respect in society, and who live in an institution that may be coercive in quite explicit terms, yet the advice is still to follow what, as Julian says, is a pretty sort of carefully set out set of principles in order to acquire consent.
Dr. Kazarian? Sorry, we can't hear you, Dr. Kazarian.
Sorry. I do agree with everything that was said. I think this document was actually quite good in the sense that it did give respect to autonomous decisions in relation to medical decision making. So I do agree with that.
And then the second document moves us forward in time, but only so far as 1968. It's MD UN 5061, please show me. We can see again it's authored by the Medical Defence Union. It's entitled in terms Consent to Treatment. If we go to the second page, we can see a date at the bottom, revised August 1968. This isn't the first version of this document, but I didn't want to take up your time by going to all versions of all documents. And then if we go to the next page, please, we can see a citation on the left-hand side from a 1912 case. No amount of professional skill can justify the substitution of the will of the surgeon for that of his patient. And then on the right-hand side, under the heading consent to treatment, there is then in the first paragraph a statement that a person suffering from disease or injury is not normally bound to submit himself to medical treatment or even to consult a doctor if he does not wish to do so. And then there is the further explanation that treatment without consent can be an assault. And then if we go to the next paragraph, please, Shomik, we can see under the heading consent may be express or implied. There is a description of the different ways in which consent can be given and the advantage of express consent over implied consent and of written consent over oral consent. And then in the second paragraph, it says this: to be an effective answer to a claim for assault, the consent must have been fully and freely given. The patient should therefore be told in non-technical language of the nature and effect of the operation. This should be done by a medical practitioner. If an inadequate or misleading explanation is given, there is the danger that the apparent consent obtained will be held to be ineffective. If the operation contemplated carries special risks which are probably unknown to the patient, he should, as a general rule, be informed of these patients. And then it goes on to talk about occasions in which a surgeon may be justified in not revealing or minimising the risks involved. And again, we'll perhaps explore that in more detail later. And then over the page, the first paragraph talks about the importance of not going outside the scope of the express instructions of the patient. And then if we go on, please, Shomik, another 2 pages. We look at the paragraph on the right-hand side, headed Non-Therapeutic Clinical Research in Institutions. I'm not going to ask you about this in any detail now because we're going to look at research tomorrow, but we can see by this point in time the World Medical Association's Declaration of Helsinki has been promulgated, and there is a discussion there of consent in the context of clinical research. Again, looking at this document from 1968, which appears to have been produced for some form of general consumption, perhaps to members from the MDU. Are there any observations that any of you have to make about it? Professor Cave?
Yeah, I think it's very similar, but giving quite a lot more detail. So it's very clear that the view of the doctor shouldn't be substituted, so that the doctor's view shouldn't carry too much weight, and that it's very important that the patient make a decision. And this focuses again on the idea of protecting the doctor from assault. So making sure that the consent is voluntary, making sure they've got enough information upon which to make that decision, and making sure they've got the mental capacity, although it wouldn't have been termed as such at that point, in order to make the decision. And so there's still less focus here on making sure that it is sufficiently informed, going beyond just making sure that the patient understands what the information is about, that basic information. But at the same time, as Julian said, it's quite impressive in other ways, insofar as there is more detail now about whether consent should be express or implied. It's making clear that it's often best to get written consent, because then there is a record of it, and also it's perhaps a better way of ensuring you don't forget anything in order to write it down. And there is the scope of the instructions is certainly wider and more comprehensive. I think what we don't know from this is who would have read it, whether this would have been something that everybody would know about, or that very few people would know about, or that was given to people if perhaps they were being sued, or that's what I don't know, how commonly known this information was. But again, it's quite an impressive document.
Can I add?
I agree with that, but I think when you turn to the appendices, you see what an interesting sort of timepiece it is, because the emphasis is so heavily on consent forms, and essentially an instance at which consent is given, which is something that we've moved away from, preferring to think of consent as a process, and that if written consent is required, it should demonstrate the preceding process in some way, not simply say what is agreed to or not. And the fact that the seemingly uncontroversial choice of consent form is that of a husband signing to agree that his wife can have a hysterectomy, even though there doesn't seem to be a suggestion that that's necessarily an emergency situation, just shows us how values and approaches to individual autonomy have shifted since that time. So I think in all these documents we see grains of what we have become very interested in, and lawyers and ethicists have developed further. But I think Emma's point is a particularly important one. To what extent was this accessible known by, and the importance of it understood in the right way by people who read it?
So I wanted to say that quote from 1910 reminded me of the surgeon not substituting their will for that of the patient, of the famous German philosopher Immanuel Kant, who has been so dominant in Europe. And one of his essential ideas was that because human beings have autonomy and they have rationality, you should always treat human beings as an end and never merely as a means. And when how you treat somebody as an end is essentially if you get their informed consent, in a nutshell. So when they understand what you're proposing and freely agree to it, you're treating them as an end. When you don't do that, you're treating them as a means. And that idea has been very dominant in Europe, and I think you can see that in that quote. And that's what's so important about obtaining informed consent, is that you're then treating the patient as an end in themselves and not merely as a means to something else.
The third piece of guidance I wanted to ask you to look at is from the British Medical Association from 1970, so a similar era. Seamus, it's BMAL 5085, please. So we can see it's a BMA publication. It's entitled Medical Ethics. The date is in the bottom right-hand corner, 1970. And if we go over the page, we can see under the title Medical Ethics, it says reprinted from the Members' Handbook 1970. So in contrast to the MDU document where we don't know precisely how it might have been disseminated, it would appear that this document is part of a handbook provided to members of the BMA. And I just want to look at a handful of passages with you and then invite your comment again. So if we go to the next page, please. We can see under the heading, the Hippocratic Oath, this statement: while the methods and details of medical practice change with the passage of time and the advance of knowledge, the fundamental principles of professional behaviour have remained unaltered through the recorded history of medicine. And then I'm not going to read out the Hippocratic Oath, but if we go on to the next page, we can then see under the heading, an International Code of Medical Ethics, the lapses from the Hippocratic ideal on the part of the profession in certain countries during the Second World War and the perpetration of crimes against the individual in the name of race or religion have shown the need for a modern restatement of the oath and a reawakening of the sense of the high calling and ethical responsibilities of the doctor. Accordingly, one of the first acts of the World Medical Association, when formed in 1947 on the initiative of the BMA to unite the profession throughout the world in a single brotherhood, was to produce a modern restatement of the Hippocratic Oath known as the Declaration of Geneva, and to base upon it an international code of medical ethics which applies both in times of peace and war. And then we can see the text of the Declaration of Geneva, and we can see on fourth line down, the health of my patient will be my first consideration. I will respect the secrets which are confided in me. And then towards the bottom of the page, we can see the English text of the International Code of Medical Ethics, duties set out. And if we go to the next page, we look at the top half of the page. So it's the next page, please, Seamus. Thank you. We can see, looking at the left-hand column, towards the bottom, any act or advice which could weaken physical or mental resistance of a human being may be used only in his interest. And then top of the next column, a doctor owes to his patient complete loyalty and all the resources of his science. Whenever an examination or treatment is beyond his capacity, he should summon another doctor who has the necessary ability, and a number of other matters there set out. And then if we see the bottom half of the page, please. We see there the reference to human experimentation and the Declaration of Helsinki, which, as I say, we'll come back to. And then if we move on, Seamus, in the document, it's to the page number 9 at the top of the page, so it's probably your page 11, Seamus. We can see there there's a description of professional confidence, and issues about confidentiality. The basis of the relationship between a doctor and his patient is that of absolute confidence and mutual respect. Picking it up in the next paragraph, professional confidence implies a doctor shall not disclose voluntarily without the consent of the patient information he's obtained. And then there's further discussion in relation to that. Now, that touches on an issue which we'll come on to tomorrow about data protection and principles of confidentiality. But are there any observations that you have on this this medical ethics section of the BMA's handbook in 1970?
Well, if you go to the very first page, right at the top, it says, you know, the doctor will be a servant to humanity and the interests of their patient will be paramount. That's the best interest principle. So you can see that principle back in 1970 in this document.
That's the third page, please, Shomik, under the heading The Brotherhood of Medicine. So the
very first couple of lines. So it says, dedicated to the service of humanity, he will be expected to subordinate his personal interests to the welfare of his patients. So I think that is a statement of the best interests principle.
Professor
And
Kay?
the idea of the service to is that essentially it's a service that they're performing for the best interests of their patient.
Professor Cave, any further observations?
Yeah, certainly. So the BMA was very active in producing guidance before the GMC perhaps took over to some extent, although the BMA still does provide a very useful and relevant and well-read handbook on medical ethics. But the GMC, if their guidance wasn't followed, then there was the possibility of taking away that particular individual's registration, whereas this perhaps didn't have quite the same teeth. So that's one particular point. The other thing perhaps to note is that this is a collection of codes from elsewhere rather than detail as to how to interpret those particular codes. It refers to the Hippocratic Oath, which obviously is an ancient oath, which doesn't focus on informed consent particularly, but does, as Julian said, focus on best interests and on upholding the reputation of the profession. The Declaration of Geneva similarly fleshes this out and modernises it to some extent, but again, it's also focusing largely on trying to protect the reputation of the profession rather than how to put patient autonomy at the forefront of decision making. We can see then a marked contrast between those codes and then the Declaration of Helsinki. I know we're going to come on to this at some point soon, but the Declaration of Helsinki refers to informed consent and fleshes this out in much more detail when it comes to research. So I think there's quite a contrast there between the clinical setting and the research setting that we can see in that guidance.
I think it's also important, as Bobby was saying with the previous document, that to view them in their entirety. And there are many aspects that I would disagree with these documents. So, for example, the Hippocratic Oath says that doctors shouldn't perform abortions, they shouldn't give drugs to end patients' lives, and they shouldn't perform surgery. So there are some quite, I believe, wrong aspects to many of these codes. So I think it's important not to cherry pick just the bits but we can see strands of thought that continue on to today, but I don't think we can accept them in their entirety.
I think it's also interesting the way in which the profession is framed and presented as a fraternity and a brotherhood. And it speaks to Emma's point about, to some extent, this is a continuation of the idea of the etiquette required and the sort of proper behaviour that comes from the very original code for doctors as professionals, rather than putting patients at the heart of it or research participants at the heart of it, as did happen with Helsinki, and working from there. So I think it's again, you have to dig a little bit and pull the bits out. There's certainly stuff there that is of interest and use that gets developed further over time. But it's presented in a way that doesn't sit comfortably with the way that we think about things now.
And then the last piece of historic guidance that I wanted to ask you to look at for present purposes is the 1980 BMA Handbook of Medical Ethics. So Shomik, that's BMAL 5087, please. If we go to the 5th page, please, Shomik. We can see a statement of what this handbook attempts to be. In this handbook, we set out the broad framework of ethics within which the medical profession works. Recent changes and pressures have increased the number and complexity of the ethical problems brought to the BMA, many of which present difficult choices between courses of action. There are certain fundamental principles underlying the whole of the book, and we've attempted in the various sections to suggest how these principles should be applied in day-to-day medical work. Changes in society require reappraisal of their application. We hope the publication of the new edition will stimulate debate. There's a wide area of agreement about these principles among doctors in all countries, but as conditions vary, we see this book mainly as a guide for doctors and medical students and others concerned with the moral issues raised by the practice of medicine in the United Kingdom. And then if we go if we go to the next page, again, I take the point it needs to be read in its entirety. I'm just going to go to a handful of passages, however. We can see there the structure of it, relationships between doctors, so history of medical ethics, relationships between doctors and individuals, relationships between doctors and group, etiquette, that word again, professional discipline, the law and codes of practice. And then there is a very short history of medical ethics, the following 2 pages. Perhaps just picking it up, if we go to the next page, please, Shomik. Just one sentence, or one paragraph, the first. Because of their special knowledge and the vulnerability of their patients, members of the medical profession have traditionally been regarded as particularly trustworthy and responsible by the public. From the profession, therefore, society expects high standards, not only of scientific education and clinical skill, but also of professional and humane conduct. And then there is, as I say, a brief discussion of history in the following 2 pages. If we go to page 11, please, Shomik. Sorry, go back 2 pages. My apologies. That's it. We can see here the beginning of the section of the book which concerns relationships between doctors and individuals. And if we look at paragraph 1.2, which is talking about the therapeutic doctor-patient relationship, the doctor then acts in the interests of the patient and is responsible to the patient for his actions. And then if we go over the page, we see 2 concepts discussed. The first is confidentiality, although we'll discuss that in more general terms tomorrow. I'll just look at what it says here. 1.6, a doctor must preserve secrecy on all he knows. There are 5 exceptions to this general principle, and they're then set out, of which the first is the patient giving consent. And then under the heading consent, so the second half of the page, please, Shomik. Paragraph 1.8, the patient's trust that his consent to treatment will not be misused is an essential part of his relationship with his doctor, but for a doctor to touch a patient without consent is an assault. Consent is valid when freely given if the patient understands the nature and consequences of what's proposed. Assumed consent or consent obtained by undue influence is valueless. Consent obtained without influence on the person is particularly important where treatment is offered to prisoners or procedures are carried out on volunteers in experiments or in the armed forces. It's also essential that no influence is exerted through any special relationship between the doctor and the person whose consent is sought, e.g. teachers and students. The necessary degree of understanding of what is proposed depends on the patient's education and intelligence, the seriousness and urgency of the condition being investigated or treated, and other, next page, relevant factors. The onus is always on the doctor carrying out the procedure to see that an adequate explanation is given. there's then a discussion of the position of different individual or different categories of patient, minors and incapacitated patients in particular. Could we go on to page 17, please, Shomik? It's the numbered page 17. So back a page. We can see there the concept of trust, which you've referred to in your evidence earlier. 2.6, the relationship between patient and doctor is based on trust. And it then emphasises the importance of the doctor being objective. And then if we go to the top of the next page, 2.8, good communication between patient and doctor is of prime importance. The failure of communication in whatever form of practice is probably the commonest cause of breakdown in the relationship between the two. There's then a detailed section or more detailed section on research, which I'll come back to tomorrow. And the text of the various codes, including the World Medical Association's code, and other declarations are set out in towards the end of the handbook. But those, I think, are the most salient paragraphs in relation to the issues that we've been discussing of relevance to the concept of informed consent. Again, can I invite any observations on this handbook as at 1980? Professor Cave?
Yeah, happy to start with that. So here we see an attempt not just to replicate codes from elsewhere, but actually to start to explain them so that they can be applied in a practical way. So there's a big shift here, I think, in relation to that. There's also a focus on relationships. So this is the beginning of a focus on the importance of partnership and on the best interest principle being an important part of that. Trustworthiness is also very important in this document. I talked briefly about the fact that there were certain factors in the sort of 50s, 60s that led to great trust in doctors. So the fact that we have the NHS in particular. And it's interesting if we compare the sections relating to clinical treatment and again the sections relating to research, where there had been atrocities in World War II, which really diminished trust in that area. So we see that there is much more focus on informed consent in relation to the Declaration of Helsinki, but it's also starting to become recognised as much more relevant in relation to treatment generally. So there is now a specific section on consent for the first time, as far as I'm aware, and it refers specifically to consent. Again, the focus, as before, is largely on making sure that the doctor isn't liable for assault. So there's reference to it being free and valid consent. But now we're starting to see more focus on the onus being on the doctor to ensure that there's an adequate understanding. And obviously, part of this flows from the importance of autonomy, but the guidance makes really clear that another part of that is trust. So truth-telling and honesty and good communication being parts of being factors that are going to lead to more trust in the profession, but also in that immediate relationship.
Are there any other observations about this medical handbook? Sorry, we can't hear you, Professor Savalas. Professor Pharsides.
Yes, I agree with everything that Emma has said, and I think most of us would recognise in this the kernels for the current Medical Ethics Today publication that the BMA that has become so large it's now only produced online. But it's similar issues and the beginning of an approach that is recognisable.
There was one line which I thought might be liable to misunderstanding, where they say the level of understanding will vary from patient to patient according to their intelligence. I can understand what they might be getting at there, but I think there's sometimes a thought that the patient is not able to understand the situation. And I think for a patient to make an autonomous decision, they have to understand the nature of the options, their risks and benefits. That's the same for everyone. Now, some people may be able to understand higher levels of technicality or understand things in more complex terms. But I think it's the same for everyone, that they need to understand the nature of their choice, regardless of their intelligence or education, in order to make an autonomous and informed decision. So I would just want to add that qualification to that line, which could lead to misunderstanding. Dr.
Kazarian.
Yes, I agree with everything that was said as well, and just picking up on Julian's point about patients' understanding. I think this document, in comparison with the previous one from the 1970s, sort of put more focus on the relationship between doctor and patient, and on good communication and trust, and wasn't just a set of rules to apply for doctors, but it also explained why doctors need to follow these rules and need to act ethically. What is lacking, however, in this document is still more focus on the patient themselves, and the fact that this sentence says the patient's understanding will differ depending on their education and intelligence. I think today is something that would be inappropriate to put in this type of document, and the wording would definitely be different. And this is why we see that this document is still not putting the patient as an individual with choices at the center of medical practice.
May I ask one question? Can we go back to the page 9, that's 009. 309. I think it may be the page, it's just 2 pages further on. Could you go to the next page? I'm trying to identify something which I noticed in passing. Yes, this is it. Under paragraph 1.6, the issue for me arising out of this is what is said under 3. It describes the doctor's duty to society as overriding. We have been talking about the doctor's duty as being primarily to act in the best interest of his patient. So on the face of it, those 2 concepts might be said to contradict each other. Do you have any comment on this?
So a doctor has a number of obligations. Their primary obligation is to promote the best interests of their patient, but they will have also an obligation to society that, when the situation is extreme enough, will override their obligation to the patient. So a classic example is reportable infectious diseases. Doctors must report these by law. So I think tuberculosis may be a reportable disease, regardless of whether it's in the interest of the patient. In a condition of a pandemic, it may be that the doctor will do something which is not in the interest of the patient in order to protect society. So if that value of obligation to society is large enough, it can outweigh the individual obligation to promote the best interests of the patient. But in general, the best interest, and this is what I mean by multiple values, that will depend on the particular factual circumstance. So yes, there's always a public interest that can override freedom, liberty, autonomy. the normal doctor-patient relationship to promote the best interest of the patient. But typically, it's the best interest of the patient which is paramount. But that's not an exclusive value or obligation. It has to be balanced against other obligations.
I wonder if this list could have been unpacked a little bit more carefully and fully, because it does take you a while to think, what exactly are they saying? And I think Julian's example is a good one. There might be another example where, given what we're talking about is something that's been set up as a duty to preserve secrecy, I think when we talk about confidentiality, we know that there are going to be exceptions to that, and some of those will be arising out of our duty to society at large or defined individuals within society. So, for example, if someone poses a great danger to others because of violent tendencies expressed within the context of a psychiatric illness, there's a question of how do we manage that? How do we share information in a responsible way? You could also say that whilst we would always want to keep people's medical records secret to the extent that we don't want people to have access to identifiable information, we might feel that we have a duty to society to understand issues such as disease prevalence. And to do that, we need to collect information, but to preserve confidentiality, we find ways of collecting and storing information that don't just ride roughshod through the idea that this is something that we would ordinarily keep confidential. So I suppose it's about this balancing of the thought that almost always it's going to be in the best interests of an individual to treat their medical information as confidential, but even that individual themselves might understand situations in which society would like to know, without being able to identify them directly, something about their health state.
And just to add very briefly, because I agree with what's been said by Julian and Bobby, that the situation, the ethical situation that they've described is mirrored to an extent in the law, insofar as the duty to protect confidentiality in law is subject to a number of exceptions that don't apply in relation to the duty to obtain informed consent before treatment.
There's one further document I want to ask you to look at. It's not a piece of guidance. It's a short article in the BMJ that you've cited in your report. Seamus, it's RLIT 301329. We can see it's dated December 1985, and the author is Rhiannon Gillan. I just want to read a couple of passages and then ask you a number of questions arising out of them. So it says, vets do not bother with their patients' consent. Why should doctors? To address this question, it's important to state which meaning of consent is being used, for the term is ambiguous. Under one definition, it simply means agreement, acceptance, or assent. It is fairly obvious, though here unargued, that this meaning of consent is not relevant to medical interventions, whether these are investigations, treatments, or research. For medical interventions, it's widely accepted that consent means a voluntary, uncoerced decision made by a sufficiently competent or autonomous person on the basis of adequate information and deliberation to accept rather than reject some proposed course of action that will affect him or her. Consent in this sense requires action by an autonomous agent based on adequate information and is, by definition, informed consent. And then if we just pick it up under the next paragraph, a few lines down, the most obvious answer, is that generally we have a moral obligation to respect each other's autonomy, at least insofar as to do so is compatible with respect for the autonomy of others. And then it goes on to discuss respect for autonomy and self-determination, which morally underpins the requirement of consent. And then last paragraph in that column, according to the above definition, to consent to medical intervention, a person requires sufficient information to be able to make an informed and deliberated choice. And it's in this context that doctors often object to the requirement for such consent. patients, they say, are unnecessarily alarmed and their medical state unnecessarily impaired if they have to be given information about their diagnosis or prognosis or risks associated with their proposed management and treatment. If we can just zoom in on that top paragraph. The alarm is compounded with confusion. The argument continues if differential diagnoses and risks have to be mentioned, and made intolerable if the patient is expected to choose between the options. As Dr. Inglefinger exclaimed, he as a patient would not want to be in the position of a shopper at the Casbah who negotiates and haggles with the physician about what is best. Indeed, the doctor who merely spreads an array of vendibles in front of the patient and then says, go ahead and choose, it's your life, is guilty of shirking his duty, if not of malpractice. And then the rest of the article continues by deconstructing the notional doctor's argument. This is December 1985, and it would seem that we see in the first few paragraphs I referred to here all the values or principles that you have identified in your report: autonomy, absence of coercion, provision of adequate information, opportunity for deliberation, and then we see the author, as it were, identifying the paternalistic approach that it would seem the author thinks some doctors might still at that stage be adopting. And I wanted to ask you a little about paternalism and what your view is of how it developed, why it developed, and where it sits in the ethical framework you've described.
Could I start with this? Because I know this article, and I think Inglefinger was the editor of the New England Journal of Medicine, the most famous journal of medicine. So he's expressing a view at that time, which was really the dominant view in amongst medical practitioners. So the origin of medical paternalism comes from a time when initially there were very few treatments that worked. So when penicillin became available, and somebody had a streptococcal infection and they were going to die, there was no question about what should be done. You prescribed penicillin. So there was no conflict of values. There were a few treatments. Patients wanted to get healthy. Doctors gave patients the treatments that made them healthy. It was very simple. However, with the advent of more complicated treatments that had multiple risks and benefits and different alternatives, and patients also had different values, that simplicity started to disappear. So, for example, chemotherapy might prolong your life but make you ill. And it was no longer clear that it was a case like just giving penicillin where all the values were aligned. As Ian said, often, a person is sick, they want to get well. There's no disagreement. And what happened, I think, was that this idea that there was just simply one value, health, and then that's all doctors had to promote, became more complicated as medicine became more probabilistic. That is, it involved risks and probabilities, and more complicated options, and also more complicated value trade-offs. And the profession failed to recognise that interests was not purely health, but something much broader than that. And around this time that Rana was writing, it started to become clear that we needed to consider not just medical interests, that is the promotion of health, narrowly construed, but something much broader than that. And that required the involvement of the patient and their values and their attitudes to risk. And that was a movement from narrow conceptions of health to ultimately what the WHO called a complete state of biopsychosocial well-being. So I think it was understandable originally why medical paternalism was dominant, but it became inappropriate around this time as medicine changed and the importance of patient values also and their relevance to medicine became more and more important.
Professor Cave.
Oh, sorry.
The context of this article was a legal framework that was inherently paternalistic. And Rana Gillen's argument is that ethics on consent should go beyond what the law requires. So autonomy, in his argument, should trump beneficence. and this requires that consent is informed. It's interesting when there's talk about alarming patients and should we go down the route of arguing patients, because there was a time when codes recommended that wasn't done, that doctors should keep certain things to themselves to make sure that patients weren't unduly alarmed, and so that they still had hope that everything would be all right. But we're looking a long time back, so Victorian times in particular. And Ian has already made the very important point that it has become very clear that that's not the right thing to do, that it's important to give even upsetting information so that patients are able to prepare. And that's recognised even in the law, in cases in the early 19th century. So it's interesting that at a time when the treatment options were really very limited, as Julian was describing, there were some legal cases which said, well, there's still a duty to inform the patient, not in order to give the patient choice as to what should be done, because the choice is fairly simple, but rather to prepare them for the ordeal that they were about to undergo. So it's an interesting shift in that regard.
Professor Vossides.
Yeah, I think it's quite useful to think about how we're defining paternalism, because there are various parts of our life where we go to experts and we're perfectly happy for them to take complete control over whatever we are consulting them about. For example, if my car is not working, I don't even need an explanation. I might like an estimate of the bill, but I don't want to be taken through all the steps and have it as some sort of collaborative exercise. A paternalist isn't necessarily, I would have to say, a bad person, because they are motivated by a notion of beneficence. But what goes slightly wrong is the extent to which they think that duty of beneficence requires them to retain control over the situation. So a classic paternalist thinks they know better what is the good thing for another person, and that is the basis upon which they will pursue whatever they think to be the good course of action. And that can persist even if somebody complains to them that they have an alternative way of seeing things, born of their own experience, and they wish to challenge. So isn't it interesting that paternalism did persist to a large degree for over a long period of time within the medical profession? And does this again go back to us having to say, what is special about this form of expertise? Were patients encouraged to understand and know about their own conditions and question and challenge and be part of things? Or did doctors feel that they were still in the best position to not only drive decisions, but sometimes to actually make decisions and withhold information, etc., not because they wished to exercise power, but because they were in a position to do so, and they chose to do so for reasons of beneficence. So I think part of Ranan's long-term project is to find some sort of balance where a plea to autonomy doesn't mean an abandonment of the patient in the way that Emma set out earlier, so that you don't suddenly get bombarded with impossible choices with no guidance or support or expert knowledge to guide you, but rather your doctor presents those to you in the best way possible, acknowledges that the decision is yours to make, and offers their expertise in a way that is appropriate to ensuring that you come to the decision that is in your best interest.
And going back to the discussion this morning about moral relativism and moral objectivism, would it be right to view paternalism in this way, that it was not ever ethically a justification for treating patients in the absence of informed consent, but it is a description of an approach taken or an attitude adopted by a cohort of clinicians in earlier times?
I would say that what happened is that doctors are the experts on disease and its treatment and prevention, and patients came to have their disease treated, and doctors believed that the patient would consent to what they were proposing because, after all, they wanted to get well. So I think that what happened is that they simply believed they, knew what the patient would consent to if they were fully rational and fully informed, and they didn't need to upset the patient by going into a lot of distressing detail, or didn't have the time to, and that they could imply consent because patients want to get well. They had a very, narrow view of health and disease and what medicine was about. That's my take on it, but others might disagree.
No, I think I agree with that. I think there was a time when decisions were seen as more simple, where it was still required that there was authority given from the patient to the doctor to go ahead with it. But it was more akin to assent, to saying, yes, I agree with you doing that, than to the informed consent that we have today.
I mean, to take the example of the streptococcal infection, what would be the point of discussing penicillin with the patient who had presented with a life-threatening streptococcal infection? And that's obviously, this is the way I think the thought process went, that you simply prescribed it because that's what the patient really wants. But of course, as medicine gets more complicated and patients have different values, that model starts to fall apart.
You described paternalism in your report as, or you've referred, I think, to Beecham and Childress's definition as the intentional overriding of one person's preferences or actions by another person, where the person who overrides justifies this action by appeal to the goal of benefiting or preventing or mitigating harm to the person whose preferences or actions are overridden. So is this fair, that paternalism may be motivated by beneficence in the way in which you've described, but it's the antithesis of respect for autonomy, at least in the way in which it's defined in your report?
There's two versions of paternalism, which I don't think define in the report. There's soft and hard paternalism, or sometimes called weak and strong paternalism. Strong or hard paternalism is where the patient is competent and able to make their own decision, but the doctor makes the decision in their best interests without involving them in the decision or even overriding their desires. That's hard paternalism. Weak or soft paternalism is where the patient has some deficiency in their decision-making capacity, and in the presence of that, the doctor does what they believe is in the best interest of the patient. Now, sometimes what was actually operating was either hard or soft paternalism. Sometimes doctors believe the patient couldn't, because of their emotional state or their ability to accommodate information, truly make a properly autonomous decision for themselves. That was soft paternalism. Or sometimes they just didn't bother or actually overrode what the patient wanted. So there can be two kinds of paternalism operating.
I think it's also worth acknowledging that there are accounts of autonomy that would allow you to delegate authority to doctors and actually give them permission or request that they behaved in ways that from the outside might look quite paternalistic. But the difference is that the patient has said, I don't have the emotional reserves to deal with this right now, or I'm finding it absolutely impossible to make sense of these forms of information. I really would value you advising me quite strongly on what to do for the best. So modern accounts of autonomy don't necessarily mean complete independence or sovereignty over your actions, but the sense comes that you give the doctor the permission and the right to be involved to that degree, rather than it being any form of assumption that historically this is the way that things have been done, or simply that the level of expertise held on the part of the doctor entitles them in some way to do that. So I think paternalism, again, it's a complex issue, and it's one that the more you talk about it, the more the heat is taken out of it to some extent, I think. And one must always remember that idea that it is motivated by beneficence, not by a wish to control or overrule.
Well, I think I think hard paternalism is generally not accepted within the sort of soft paternalism might be capable of being justified, but I think hard paternalism of overriding a person's wish, a competent person's wish, I think is extremely difficult to justify.
I'm not talking about justification, I'm talking about motivation.
So I've noted the time. I've still got a number of further questions on the issue of informed consent I want to explore, but would this be an appropriate moment for a break?
Yes. On this occasion, shall we take until 4 o'clock? Would that give everyone long enough? Please tell me if it won't. 4 o'clock. Thank you very much.
Thank you.